attempt today would be to kind of give you a basic intro on how the body keeps score, about how our minds and bodies are connected. Okay, we will talk about that's part one. In the part two, we'll talk about why it's important to explore that connection, right? Why we're even talking about this, we will talk about that. And of course, the third part is the part that is directly relevant to all of you, because the connection between mind and body is not just something that we should concern ourselves with only in therapy. It should concern ourselves. It should concern us whether we're a student, whether we're a working professional, whether we're a homemaker, whether we are a male, female, TG, any and every socio-demographic that there is. The connection between mind and body is supreme. So in the third part, I will try to do justice to, again, scratching the surface, but I will try to give you a few exercises, some reflection exercises, some actual exercises on how you can best support your well-being by focusing on the connection between your mind and body. In Eastern practices, right? I mean, I'm glad there are people from Indonesia as well, because in Eastern, Southeast Asian practices, actually the field of medicine or the field of treating the body has always encompassed the mind. You know, if you look at any of the ancient Indian practices, for example, yoga, yeah, or any of those Chinese practices like beating drums, or chanting, or hymns like in Buddhism, all of these practices actually honor, not only acknowledge, but honor the mind and body connection. It was unfortunately only in Western medicine that body was treated only as body and mind was treated separately, which was very, very disjointed, right? You'll be surprised to know that it was only 30 years ago that in the West, that the mind body connection started being researched. And this happened when there was a certain Dr. Spiegel, a very famous neuropsychiatrist at Stanford University. He found that women with breast cancer who participated in a group mindfulness therapy, they actually had less pain, improved quality of life, and longer life. They live longer than women who receive traditional medical care alone, right? This happened this in this study when Dr. Spiegel found this, just as recent as 30 years back. That is when the mind body connection research entered the mainstream in Western psychology and Western science. So you can imagine that something that Eastern practices have been saying for thousands of years was we're only researching it only now scientifically, in that sense, right? So to the next section about why it's important to explore the mind body connection. If you're not convinced already, hopefully you will be convinced that we need to look at the mind body connection. Basically argues that people who suffer emotionally, any kind of emotionally overwhelming experiences, any kind of traumatic experiences in your life, you are unlikely to suffer only in your mind. That suffering will show up in your body. Okay, how does this emotional suffering show up in your body? I mean, I'm stressed at work, how will it show up in my body? It can show up in little and big things. It can show up in my posture, in the way I sit or stand, or as Ankit was saying, it can show up in the way I touch somebody else. It can even show up in the way we breathe. In fact, there have been not just psychologists but even philosophers who claim that breath is what is the connection between mind and body. So it can show up in the way we breathe. I mean, and that's very obvious, right? When we are, say, nervous or tensed or scared or even excited, right? We can see that our breath, we have shortness of breath, right? So our mental state directly affects our body. Our sleeping patterns, right? Sleeping patterns is one thing that we always assess whenever we are seeing a new client in therapy, because that is one of the first things. Sleeping and eating patterns are few of the first things that go awry when a person is suffering emotionally. Your digestion processes, I mean, you would imagine that something as internal as how your gut and how your body is responding will not be influenced by your emotional state, but it is. I mean, there's so many things. Literally every part of our bodies can be broken down to how emotions or our feelings or our minds are impacting our physical body and our physical organs, and even your attitude towards your exercise. And this is extremely interesting. But now, normally, what happens is when we are undergoing some kind of stress, right? our brain immediately enters into a state which is called the crisis state. We call this a fight or flight mechanism. Now, our brains today, our modern day brains, still do not differentiate between big or small danger. To our brain, anything that poses a threat is danger. But what happens in trauma, our brain, instead of sending itself into a fight or flight mode, preparing our body to fight or flee from that danger, when we experience trauma, right, it changes the way our brain functions. Okay. When we experience any event which we find absolutely intolerable, it produces actual changes in our brain. And the first thing, it does many, many things, but for the sake of simplicity, I've broken it down into one or two things. It basically shuts down what is meant to be a safety or protective mechanism for us. It shuts down the fight or flight response. So basically, the one response that helps us survive is shut down. But the brain continues to secrete the stress hormone, this which is cortisol. So can you imagine the confusion that is happening? My brain is at one end telling me, babe, there's no danger, chill, calm down. But it's continuing to secrete the stress hormone. So what happens is later, like I go through life, there are many, many experiences that I undergo. And later what happens is that every time I'm reminded of whatever was my original traumatic event, every time I'm reminded of that, it is called a trigger, right? Every time I'm triggered, right? I might not be currently experiencing that trauma, that stressor, but I'm triggered every time because my body is still reacting like it did that time because the stress hormone is still being secreted. It's like, imagine this, that you have a faulty smoke detector. What happens? There is no smoke, but the smoke detector is still going blip, blip, blip. Imagine that happening in our brain. When a person has undergone trauma, right, which overwhelms them, which basically overtakes their capacity to cope, their their brain malfunctions in a way that they're no longer able to identify this is safe and this is not safe. It is like a faulty smoke detector. And what then that happens is thinking brain. So imagine that our brain is divided into two portions very broadly. One is a feeling brain, which regulates all our feelings, and one is a thinking brain, through which we use all our logic, decision making, planning, etc. Now, what happens when we undergo trauma is what happens in the brain is there is a disconnect between the feeling brain and the thinking brain, which means our feeling brain goes on an overdrive. Everything from the smallest of things to the biggest of things, we are overreacting or overfeeling. It's on an overdrive. It's not able to regulate itself. So even for the smallest of things, we feel out of control. But the stuff that is supposed to regulate the feeling brain, the thinking brain, the stuff which says, calm down, this is not danger. It is actually, it's almost like shut down, when we meet with the trigger. So the two parts of the brain are not working in sync anymore. So you can imagine what a havoc that can cause on a person in their daily experiences. So you would still navigate your way through everyday life, but there are certain points, private points, which you might not share with everyone, where you feel that no, something is wrong. Why did I snap when it was nothing? What was I doing? Why was I feeling overwhelmed? There was nothing, or something like that. So what can I do with all this knowledge, right? Okay, fine. I'm convinced there is an interlink between mind and body in a way that I cannot delink both of them. Fair enough. But what can I do with this knowledge? And how can I use this knowledge to support my own well-being, right? So, I think this is pretty obvious from what we've talked about till now, right? Why do we want to strengthen the connection between our minds and bodies? Why do we aspire to have our minds and bodies in sync with each other? My assertion is that as I said, right, that we've gotten so busy in our everyday lives, we just don't pay attention to our bodies unless we are, say, actively exercising. I've seen people that who regularly exercise are still somewhat in touch with their bodies. People who meditate are still in somewhat in touch with their bodies, but the rest of us really not. So why does it make sense to pay attention to this connection? Why should we even listen to our body? we Because this enables us to actually trust in our experiences, to feel more connected to ourselves, and to feel safety. Okay. Now, this is what happens when we're disconnected with, and these are very, very few examples, but these are still examples. When we're disconnected with ourselves, we experience sometimes these aches and pains in random parts of our body, and we're like, hey, what happened? Nothing happened. Why am I feeling this pain? Out of the blue, we might feel fatigued or tired. We might feel that suddenly my head is spinning. Why is my head spinning? Inflammation, of course, and inflammation is a medical concept which shows that if there is something wrong in any part of my body, right, it'll have some kind of swelling, or it'll like a fever, or something, redness or something, right? Inflammation is a very broad term, which is why I'm using it here, because it could be anything wrong in any part of our body, honestly speaking. But what happens to us emotionally? We might feel overwhelmed. But why am I feeling overwhelmed? What happened to me? I don't know. Sometimes we might feel a sense of emptiness inside. We might feel, I'm not really able to relate with a whole lot of people. I feel out of touch with others. And of course, I've mentioned this, being overly busy. We just sort of busy ourselves so much. And a lot of times, actually, I don't know if you'll agree with me or not, but a lot of times I've seen that we actually busy ourselves because unconsciously, somewhere, it helps us avoid the discomfort of facing our own difficult feelings. Right?
I think there is one recent question on how do we heal our inner child. I think very related to the today's topic.
Yes, I love that question. Thank you so much, whoever asked it. So the simple and the not so simple answer to that question is, the first step is always self-awareness, right? The first step is always to recognize what are the needs of my inner child, to go back to my childhood and reflect, what did my inner child need? And to even answer that question, you would actually have to be in touch with yourself and answer, what do I need right now? What are my emotional needs? When I ask people this in therapy, the first response is, hey, what do you mean? What does that mean? What does it mean that what are your emotional needs? So emotional needs are the needs to be loved, to be seen, and to be heard. These are the fundamental emotional needs, and they can be expressed or fulfilled in a number of ways. For example, just a very, very simple example is, I mean, of course, Ankit talked about the need to be touched, but another example is just, the need to have the feeling that I need to move my body, I need to exercise, can be an emotional need, because when I exercise, I am so much in touch with my body, and I feel so alive that it helps me fill my cup. It helps me feel emotionally alive as well. Right? So that's just an example. But how do I heal my inner child is, one, recognize, it all comes from self-awareness. Recognize what are your emotional needs now, and then reflect back to what were some of the needs that you had as a child, emotional needs that you had as a child. Which ones were your caregivers able to fulfill? Which ones you feel are not fulfilled even now? And that means that you now, as an adult, have the responsibility of fulfilling them yourself.